The summer of 2014 arrived in Dehradun with the kind of heat that made the distant Himalayan peaks seem like a mirage of relief. In a modest house on the eastern edge of town, Arjun Mehta was packing his backpack with the meticulous care of someone who understood that small oversights in the mountains could cascade into catastrophe. He folded clothes into tight rolls, checked his first aid kit twice, ensured his water bottles were clean and functional. His mother, Mira, watched from the doorway with an expression that mixed pride and dread in equal measure. She had raised her son to be adventurous, to test himself against the world, but now that he was actually leaving for a 10-day motorcycle journey through some of India's most treacherous mountain passes, every maternal instinct screamed at her to lock the doors and refuse to let him go. But she said nothing. What could she say that would not sound like the paranoid fears of an overprotective parent? Young men needed adventure. They needed to prove themselves, to feel the rush of risk and the satisfaction of survival. She had no rational reason to stop him, only the nameless heaviness in her chest that mothers sometimes feel, the premonition that arrives without evidence and refuses to leave. Arjun was 24 years old, recently graduated with an engineering degree that had taken 5 hard years to complete. He had secured a position at a technology firm in Bangalore, a job that would consume 60 hours of his week and leave little room for spontaneity or freedom. This trip was his farewell to youth, his last grasp at the unstructured life he was about to lose. He had planned it with his best friend Vikram Singh, who lived 3 houses down the same street they had grown up on together. Vikram and Arjun had been inseparable since childhood, the kind of friends whose bond needed no explanation or maintenance. They simply existed in each other's orbit, finishing each other's sentences, communicating in half words, and shared glances that carried complete meaning. Vikram was also 24, also standing at the threshold of adult responsibility. He was preparing to join his father's construction business, a practical choice that would provide stability and eventually inheritance, but would also mean the end of carefree wandering. The two friends had spent months planning this journey, studying maps with the intensity of military strategists, researching weather patterns and road conditions, reading travel blogs from other motorcyclists who had survived the routes they intended to take. They would ride Vikram's Royal Enfield, a dark blue machine that he had maintained with religious devotion through progressively remote mountain passes in Uttarakhand. The plan was to reach the high-altitude settlement of Malari, a village that sat at over 10,000 feet elevation, accessible only by roads that were barely roads at all, more like suggestions carved into cliff faces, where one moment of inattention could result in a 1,000-foot fall into rocky oblivion. For Vikram's family, the trip generated similar anxiety. His father, Rajesh Singh, was a construction contractor who had spent decades building infrastructure in mountain regions. He knew intimately the dangers that awaited careless travelers. Landslides could bury entire sections of road without warning. Weather could shift from clear to catastrophic in minutes. Mechanical failures on isolated passes could leave travelers stranded for days. He had made Vikram promise to check in every evening by phone, to avoid riding after dark, to turn back immediately if conditions deteriorated. Vikram had promised everything, with the casual confidence of young men who believe themselves immortal. Vikram's mother, Priya, expressed her concerns differently. She cooked for 3 days straight, preparing foods that would survive the journey, packing them into containers with instructions for reheating. She triple-checked the motorcycle's first aid kit, adding extra bandages, antiseptic, pain medication. She made both boys promise to wear their helmets always, to ride slowly on dangerous sections, to trust their instincts if something felt wrong. They promised, hugged her, assured her they would be fine. On the evening of June 13, both families gathered for a small send-off dinner at Vikram's house. It was meant to be celebratory, but the atmosphere carried undertones of farewell that felt too heavy, too final. Mira kept finding excuses to look at her son, memorizing his face as though she might forget it. Rajesh told stories about his own adventures in the mountains, stories meant to be cautionary but that Vikram and Arjun heard as inspirational. The evening ended with hugs that lasted slightly too long, with reminders to be safe that were repeated slightly too many times. The next morning, the 14th of June 2014, dawned clear and warm. Arjun and Vikram met at Vikram's house just after sunrise, while the town was still quiet and the air still held the coolness of night. They loaded their gear onto the motorcycle with practiced efficiency backpacks secured with bungee cords, sleeping bags strapped down, a small tent rolled tight and fastened to the rear rack. Arjun had purchased a GoPro camera specifically for this trip, and he mounted it to his helmet, testing angles and settings until he was satisfied with the field of view. He wanted to document everything, to create a video record of their adventure that they could watch in their old age, laughing at how young and fearless they had been. They performed a final check of the motorcycle tire pressure, oil level, brake function, chain tension. Everything was perfect. Vikram had tuned the engine until it purred with mechanical contentment. The Royal Enfield was ready for mountain roads, and so were they. Their parents emerged from houses to watch them leave. There were final hugs, final reminders, final waves. And then Vikram kick-started the motorcycle, the distinctive thump of the Royal Enfield engine breaking the morning silence, and they rolled forward. Arjun sat behind Vikram, his arms wrapped loosely around his friend's waist, his helmet-mounted camera recording their departure. They accelerated down the street, turned the corner, and were gone, their engine sound fading into the distance and then into memory. Neighbors who saw them leave would later describe the image: two young men on a dark blue motorcycle, riding into the early morning with their whole lives ahead of them, laughing about something, already tasting the freedom of the open road. It was the last time anyone could confirm with absolute certainty that they saw Arjun Mehta and Vikram Singh alive. The first day of their journey unfolded exactly according to plan. They rode north from Dehradun, climbing gradually into the foothills of the Himalayas, the air cooling as elevation increased, the landscape transforming from urban sprawl to agricultural valleys to forested mountain slopes. They stopped frequently to rest, to drink water, to take photographs and video footage. The GoPro captured everything: winding roads that clung to mountainsides, bridges that spanned gorges so deep that rivers below looked like silver threads, villages where children ran alongside the motorcycle waving and shouting. By late afternoon, they had reached the town of Joshimath, a way station for travelers heading deeper into the mountains. It was a small town that existed primarily to service trekkers, pilgrims, and adventure tourists. They found a small restaurant, ate a late lunch of rice and dal and vegetables that tasted extraordinary after hours of riding. They wandered through the market, bought supplies, extra batteries, packets of biscuits, bottles of electrolyte drink. They spoke with other travelers, exchanging information about road conditions ahead, learning which passes were clear and which were still dealing with rockfall debris from recent storms. As the sun began to set, they rode a few kilometers out of town to a designated camping area that other motorcyclists had recommended. It was a cleared space beside a small stream, surrounded by pine forest, with a stone fire ring that showed evidence of frequent use. They set up their tent with the ease of people who had practiced this many times, gathered firewood, boiled water for instant noodles. As darkness settled over the mountains and stars began to emerge in impossible numbers, they sat by their small fire and felt the satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. At 6 in the evening, Vikram pulled out his phone and sent a text message to his father. Day 1 complete. Camped near Joshimath. Roads rough but beautiful. All good. The message went through, and Rajesh responded immediately with a thumbs-up emoji and a reminder to be careful. Vikram showed the exchange to Arjun, and they both laughed at the parental worry that would never quite go away no matter how old they became. They talked for hours that night, the way friends do when removed from the distractions of normal life. They talked about their childhoods, their families, their fears about the futures they were about to enter. They talked about the lives they wanted to build, the people they wanted to become. They made half-serious plans to quit their jobs in a few years and start a business together, something involving adventure travel, something that would let them keep doing this forever. The fire burned down to coals, and eventually they retreated to their tent, sleeping bags zipped up against the mountain cold, falling asleep to the sound of the stream and the wind moving through pine branches. The next morning, June 15, they woke early and broke camp. The plan was to ride deeper into the mountains, following increasingly remote roads toward their ultimate destination of Malari. This was where the journey would become truly challenging, where maintained roads would give way to rough tracks, where other travelers would become increasingly scarce. They rode out from their campsite as the sun was just beginning to illuminate the eastern peaks, and they disappeared into the mountains, following a road that wound higher and deeper into wilderness. And somewhere along that road, on that bright June morning, something happened that would transform two young men on an adventure into one of the most baffling mysteries in the history of missing persons cases in India. The first indication that something was wrong came on the evening of June 15, when no message arrived from Vikram. Rajesh waited until 7 in the evening, then 8, then 9. He sent several text messages. "Call when you can. Everything okay? Let me know you're safe." The messages showed as delivered but not read. He tried calling. The phone rang several times and then went to voicemail. He left a message asking Vikram to call back, trying to keep his voice calm, trying not to let worry bleed into words. Meera experienced the same silence from Arjun. She had not expected a call. Arjun was notoriously bad about checking in, but when she tried to reach him that evening, his phone also went unanswered. She told herself that reception was probably poor, that they were probably in a valley or a tunnel or some remote area where signals could not penetrate. Mountain regions were notorious for communication dead zones. She would wait until tomorrow. Surely by tomorrow they would call, but June 16 brought only continued silence. Both families tried repeatedly to make contact. Calls went unanswered. Messages went unread. The delivery confirmations that had been routine suddenly felt ominous. By afternoon, worry had solidified into something heavier. These were not careless boys. They knew their families would worry. They had promised to check in. The silence was not neglect, it was absence. By evening of June 16, both families were in contact with each other, comparing notes, trying to determine if either had heard anything. Neither had. They began discussing next steps. Should they wait another day? Should they contact authorities? What could authorities do? The boys were adults, traveling voluntarily. 48 hours of silence in mountain regions might not constitute an emergency, but every parental instinct screamed that something was wrong. Meera made the decision on the morning of June 17. She called the police station in Dehradun and explained the situation. The officer who answered listened with professional patience and took down information: names, ages, descriptions, last known location, vehicle details. He explained that missing persons reports technically required a longer waiting period, but given the circumstances, young men in mountain terrain, complete communication silence, he would file the report immediately and begin making inquiries. But Rajesh could not simply wait for bureaucratic processes. By midday on June 17, he had loaded his car with supplies and was driving toward Joshimath, determined to begin searching himself. Meera and her husband Suresh joined him, and they made the 6-hour drive in tense silence, each of them cycling through scenarios in their minds, trying to find explanations that were not catastrophic. They arrived in Joshimath in the early evening and immediately began asking questions. They showed photographs to hotel managers, restaurant owners, shopkeepers, police at the local checkpost. Some people remembered seeing two young men on a motorcycle, or they thought they did, or maybe it was different young men. Memory is unreliable, and during peak travel season, hundreds of similar-looking adventure tourists passed through these towns. One restaurant owner remembered them more clearly. Two friends, he said, one slightly taller, both wearing riding jackets, both friendly and enthusiastic. They had eaten lunch at his establishment, asked about road conditions, bought some packaged food to take with them. They had seemed experienced, well-prepared, not reckless. He remembered thinking they would be fine. He had been wrong. The family spent the night in Joshimath, barely sleeping, and the next morning they filed a formal missing persons report with the local police station. The officer in charge was a man named Inspector Dawan, who had handled missing persons cases before and understood the particular challenges of mountain searches. He listened carefully, took detailed notes, and promised that a search operation would begin immediately. Within 24 hours, a coordinated search effort was underway. Local police were joined by Forest Department rangers who knew the terrain intimately, by disaster management teams trained in mountain rescue, by civilian volunteers from trekking clubs and mountaineering associations. The search focused initially on the route between Joshimath and Malari. the path that Arjun and Vikram had intended to travel. This was brutal terrain, narrow roads carved into sheer cliff faces, sections where one side of the road was vertical rock, and the other side was vertical drop into rocky gorges hundreds of feet below. Search teams moved slowly and carefully, examining every section of visible road, looking for any sign that a motorcycle had gone off the edge. They looked for skid marks, for broken guardrails, for disturbed soil or vegetation that might indicate a vehicle had left the road. They found nothing. The road showed normal wear potholes, cracks, patches of loose gravel, but no evidence of a recent accident. Teams rappelled down cliff faces to search ravines below, pushing through dense vegetation, searching for wreckage or bodies or any trace of the missing men. They found nothing. It was as though the two friends and their motorcycle had simply evaporated. On the fourth day of searching, a witness came forward who seemed to offer a genuine lead. A truck driver named Ramesh Kumar reported that he had seen two young men on a dark-colored Royal Enfield motorcycle on the afternoon of June 15, at a location known locally as Death Curve. This was a particularly notorious section of road where the path bent sharply around a blind corner with a cliff face on one side and a sheer drop on the other. Accidents happened there regularly, usually during monsoon season when roads were slick, but also in dry conditions when drivers misjudged the turn. The truck driver remembered the encounter because the motorcycle had been moving slowly, almost tentatively, and he had needed to sound his horn to pass. He had pulled alongside them on a straight section just after the curve, and as he passed, he had glanced over and seen two young men, both wearing helmets, both looking serious and focused. The time, he estimated, was around 4 in the afternoon on June 15. This sighting immediately redirected search efforts. If the timeline was accurate, Arjun and Vikram had been nearly a full day behind their planned schedule. Something had already delayed them before they reached Death Curve. Had they stopped to help someone? Taken a long break? Gotten lost? The delay suggested that things were not going according to their plan even before whatever happened to them actually happened. Search teams concentrated on the area around Death Curve with renewed intensity. The cliff face was examined for any signs of impact. The ravine below was searched with particular care, teams spending days combing through thick vegetation and rocky terrain, calling names, looking for any trace. Search dogs trained in cadaver detection were brought in and given clothing items from both young men to establish scent. The dogs were led along the road section, given time and space to work. Near the edge of Death Curve, one of the dogs became agitated. It was a German shepherd named Raja, and he suddenly pulled toward the cliff edge, whining and circling, exhibiting behavior that his handler interpreted as a possible scent detection. The ravine directly below that point was searched with extreme thoroughness. Teams spent 2 full days covering every square meter, looking under every boulder, checking every crevice large enough to conceal a body. They found nothing. Whatever had triggered the dog's response, if it was a genuine hit and not a false positive, did not correspond to any visible evidence. No bodies, no wreckage, no personal belongings, nothing. Another witness emerged on the 6th day of searching. A shepherd named Ganesh, who grazed his flock on high meadows above the road, came forward with information that seemed potentially significant, but was frustratingly vague. On the night of June 15, he reported, he had heard a loud sound like a crash, followed by what might have been human voices shouting. The sounds had echoed strangely off the mountain faces, making it impossible to pinpoint a direction or distance. He had noted the time approximately 9:30 at night, because he had just finished his evening meal. The shepherd's testimony raised more questions than it answered. If Arjun and Vikram had been at Death Curve at 4 in the afternoon, where had they been at 9:30 at night? The distance from Death Curve to any reasonable camping location was not great. Had they been riding in darkness, violating their own safety protocols? Had they stopped somewhere and then continued? Had they encountered trouble that delayed them further? And what had the shepherd heard? A motorcycle crash? A rockfall? Something else? The sounds, carried and distorted by mountain acoustics, could have originated from kilometers away. The shepherd could not provide more specificity. He had heard something, but he could not say with certainty what or where. Police expanded their investigation beyond simple accident scenarios. They began considering alternatives that were darker and more disturbing. Could the two young men have been victims of robbery? Mountain roads, while generally safe, were not immune to crime. There had been isolated incidents of travelers being attacked, their vehicles stolen, their belongings taken. Investigators began quietly interviewing known criminals in the region, looking for anyone who might have been active during that time frame. This line of investigation yielded nothing. The usual suspects all had alibis or were in jail or were simply not involved. No stolen motorcycle matching Vikram's bike had appeared in any black market. No one was bragging about a score. The criminal networks that police monitored showed no unusual activity during mid-June. Could they have been kidnapped? Could someone have taken them for ransom? Both families, while not wealthy, were reasonably comfortable. Arjun's father worked in banking. Vikram's father owned a construction company. Perhaps someone had targeted them, believing they could extract money from desperate families. But this theory also collapsed under scrutiny. No ransom demand was ever made. No contact of any kind came from potential kidnappers. Weeks passed, then months, with no communication. Kidnapping without ransom demand made no sense. Animal attack was considered and largely dismissed. The region was home to leopards and, at higher elevations, occasional bears. But predator attacks on two adult humans together, in daylight or even twilight, were extraordinarily rare, and such an attack would leave evidence: blood, torn clothing, drag marks, remains. The complete absence of any such evidence argued strongly against wildlife involvement. As June turned into July, the intensive search operation began to wind down. Police and Forest Department resources could not be dedicated indefinitely to a case that was producing no leads, no evidence, no direction for investigation. Helicopter surveys had been conducted, covering vast areas of terrain, looking for any sign of wreckage or bodies. The helicopters found nothing. Ground teams had covered hundreds of kilometers of roads and trails. They found nothing. The families, refusing to accept the scaling back of official efforts, hired private investigators. These investigators, experienced in missing persons cases, approached the mystery with fresh eyes and different methodologies. They interviewed witnesses again, cross-checked timelines, studied weather reports from June 15 and 16, examined satellite imagery of the region. They produced reports full of data and analysis, but empty of answers. The trail, such as it was, had gone completely cold. By August 2014, 2 months after the disappearance, the case had been effectively relegated to the cold case files. The official police file remained open, as missing persons cases do, but no detective was actively working it. The occasional tip would come in. Someone thought they saw one of the missing men in Nepal, or Delhi, or Kerala, and these would be investigated perfunctorily and dismissed. The tips were always cases of mistaken identity or deliberate hoaxes. The families tried everything. They distributed missing persons posters throughout Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, into Nepal and Tibet. The posters showed photographs of both young men, smiling and alive, with descriptions and contact information. They placed advertisements in newspapers and on television. They created social media campaigns that went moderately viral, generating thousands of shares and hundreds of tips, none of which led anywhere. Psychics and mystics began contacting the families, claiming to have visions or spiritual insights into the disappearance. Some charged fees. Others offered their services for free, motivated by genuine desire to help or by ego-driven certainty in their own powers. The families, desperate enough to consider anything, entertained several of these supposed seers. One claimed the boys were alive in a remote village, suffering from amnesia. Another insisted they had been abducted by aliens. A third described a cave where their bodies could be found. None of these claims led to anything but wasted time and renewed heartbreak. By the end of 2014, 6 months after the disappearance, the families had been forced into a cruel acceptance. Their sons were gone. Dead or alive, they were gone, and the chances of finding them decreased with every passing day. Bodies decompose, evidence degrades, memories fade, the world moves on, and the families were left suspended in a limbo that had no name, no category, no established ritual. They could not have funerals without bodies. They could not achieve closure without answers. They simply existed in the perpetual present tense of loss, grieving people who might be dead, but also might not be. Years have a way of passing, regardless of whether anyone is ready for them to pass. Seasons cycled, Festivals came and went. The families of Arjun Mehta and Vikram Singh continued living because stopping was not an option, but their lives had been fundamentally altered, permanently marked by absence. Meera kept Arjun's room exactly as he had left it. His bed remained made with the sheets he had last slept on. His clothes hung in the closet, and his shoes sat in a neat row on the floor. His desk held his laptop, his notebooks, his small collection of books about mountaineering and adventure travel. She would enter the room periodically to clean, to dust surfaces that never got dusty because no one disturbed them. She would sit on his bed and hold his pillow and cry in a way that she did not allow herself to cry anywhere else in the house. The grief changed her physically. She lost weight, her face becoming gaunt, her eyes developing a haunted quality that never quite went away. Friends tried to help, tried to provide comfort, but there are no words adequate to the task of consoling someone whose child has vanished into mystery. Eventually, most people stopped trying, not from cruelty, but from their own helplessness. Meera found herself increasingly isolated, her only real comfort coming from a support group for families of missing persons that met monthly in a community center in Dehradun. Arjun's father, Suresh, dealt with grief differently. He threw himself into his work at the bank with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He volunteered for extra shifts, accepted assignments that required travel, filled every waking hour with professional activity. It was avoidance dressed up as productivity, and everyone around him recognized it, but no one knew how to help him. The alternative to constant work was constant thinking, and constant thinking led only to dark places where his mind would cycle endlessly through scenarios of what might have happened to his son. At home, Suresh became distant, present physically but absent emotionally. He and Meera existed in the same house, but in separate universes of grief, unable to comfort each other because they were each drowning. Their marriage did not end. They never discussed separation or divorce, but it transformed into something more like parallel survival. Two people weathering the same storm but unable to hold on to each other while doing so. Vikram's father, Rajesh, developed severe insomnia that no medication seemed to truly help. He would lie awake for hours, his mind refusing to shut down, constantly replaying those final days, constantly searching for what he had missed, what he could have done differently. Should he have forbidden the trip? Should he have insisted on going with them? Should he have bought them a satellite phone that would have worked where cell phones did not? The questions were pointless. He knew they were pointless, but knowing something is pointless does not stop the mind from obsessing over it. He began spending his sleepless nights studying maps, reading everything he could find about the region where his son had disappeared. He learned the names of every peak, every pass, every village. He studied weather patterns, geological formations, historical incidents. He became an amateur expert on the terrain, as if knowledge could somehow reach back through time and protect his son from whatever had happened. His construction business suffered. He could not focus on contracts and deadlines and client meetings when his son was somewhere unknown, dead or alive, and he did not know which. Employees learned to handle most decisions themselves, to bother Rajesh only when absolutely necessary. The business survived, but it limped along where it had once thrived. Priya, Vikram's mother, channeled her grief into research. She joined online communities dedicated to missing persons cases, connecting with families around the world who were experiencing similar nightmares. She learned about search techniques, about how bodies decompose in different environments, about the psychological profiles of people who disappear voluntarily versus those who are taken. She became an expert in disappearance, accumulating knowledge that was both fascinating and utterly useless for finding her son. She started a blog documenting their experience, partly as therapy and partly in hopes that sharing their story might generate new leads. The blog attracted a modest following, mostly other families of missing persons who found comfort in shared experience. Occasionally, someone would leave a comment claiming to have information, but these always turned out to be hoaxes or misunderstandings. Every year on June 14, the anniversary of departure, both families would make a pilgrimage to Joshimath. They would stay overnight, and in the morning they would drive to a spot on the roadside where they had built a small shrine, just a collection of stones with a metal plaque bearing both names and the dates. Arjun Mehta and Vikram Singh, lost June 2014, never forgotten. They would place fresh flowers, light incense, and stand in silence for a time. It was not a grave, but it gave them somewhere to direct their grief, somewhere physical to visit, when the weight of absence became unbearable. Local residents in Joshimath came to recognize them, the families who returned each year to mourn at a roadside shrine for boys whose bodies were never found. Some locals would approach to offer condolences, to share their own stories of loss in the mountains, to light their own incense at the shrine. The families came to appreciate these small kindnesses, these acknowledgments that their loss mattered even to strangers. False leads continued to surface sporadically, each one a small cruelty. In 2015, someone reported seeing a young man matching Arjun's description in a hospital in Kathmandu, suffering from severe amnesia and unable to provide identification. Meera and Suresh flew to Nepal the same day, their hearts pounding with hope and terror in equal measure. The young man was not their son. The resemblance was superficial at best, obvious once they saw him in person, but from a distance and through the distortion of desperate hope, he had seemed possible. In 2016, a motorcycle was found abandoned in Himachal Pradesh, partially hidden by vegetation, and the model matched Vikram's bike. Rajesh drove 8 hours to inspect it, barely sleeping, barely eating, sustained only by the possibility that this might be the breakthrough. The vehicle identification number did not match. It was a similar bike but not the right bike. Another dead end. In 2017, a trekker claimed to have found personal belongings, a backpack and sleeping bag in a remote area that matched descriptions of Arjun's gear. Police investigated, retrieved the items, analyzed them. They belonged to a different traveler who had lost them months earlier. Not even close. Each false alarm followed the same pattern. Sudden hope, frantic activity, travel, investigation, and then the crushing realization that this was not the answer. And after each disappointment, the families would sink a little deeper into the quicksand of unresolved grief, a little more exhausted, a little less resilient. Social media brought its own particular brand of torture. Well-meaning people would periodically share the old missing persons posters, generating brief waves of attention. Each time, the family's phones would light up with messages, people claiming to have seen something, remembered something, knew something. Nearly all of these were dead ends, mistaken identity, confused timelines, attention seekers. But the families could not afford to ignore any of them, could not risk dismissing the one message that might actually matter. Online conspiracy theorists discovered the case around 2018 and began weaving elaborate narratives. Some claimed government involvement, suggesting that Arjun and Vikram had stumbled onto a secret military installation and been disappeared to protect classified information. Others went in paranormal directions, talking about UFO abductions or portals to other dimensions. A particularly persistent theory suggested that the two men had faked their own deaths and were living under new identities somewhere, though this theory could never explain why they would do such a thing or how they would have executed it. The families learned to ignore the conspiracy theories, but they could not ignore the pain that such speculation caused. Their sons were real people, not characters in someone else's mystery narrative. The theories, no matter how well-intentioned, reduced genuine tragedy to entertainment. By 26 years after the disappearance, the families had achieved what might be called functional grief. They had learned to continue living while carrying the weight of unresolved loss. They went to work, maintained their homes, participated in family gatherings and community events with the mechanical competence of people whose inner selves were elsewhere. They spoke of Arjun and Vikram in past tense sometimes and present tense other times, the grammar of their loss reflecting its fundamental ambiguity. Meera had become active in advocacy, working with organizations that supported families of missing persons, pushing for better search resources and protocols. The work gave her purpose and allowed her to transform her grief into something that might help others. She testified before government committees, lobbied for legislative changes, connected families with resources. She could not bring her son back, but she could perhaps make the experience slightly less terrible for future families. Rajesh had finally found medication that allowed him a few hours of sleep most nights, though he still woke frequently, his mind immediately jumping to his son, to the unanswered questions, to the void where understanding should be. He had stepped back from active management of his construction business, promoting younger partners to handle day-to-day operations, freeing himself to spend time researching, investigating, traveling occasionally to follow up on leads that still occasionally emerged. Suresh had retired early from the bank, unable to maintain the intensity of his work as avoidance strategy. In retirement, he faced the grief more directly, no longer able to hide behind professional obligations. He and Mira began attending therapy together, trying to rebuild a connection that grief had eroded. It was slow work, painful work, but it was something. Priya had written a book about their experience, a memoir titled Waiting, Life in the Shadow of Disappearance. The book was published by a small press and sold modestly but received good reviews. Many readers were other families of missing persons who found validation in seeing their experience acknowledged. Priya donated all proceeds to organizations that conducted search and rescue operations in mountain regions. In 2021, 7 years after the disappearance, a journalist from a national magazine contacted both families about doing a feature story on long-term missing persons cases. The resulting article was published in a prominent magazine, generating another wave of attention. For a few weeks, the case was discussed on television news programs, debated on social media, analyzed by armchair investigators. Tips poured in, hundreds of them, and police were obligated to investigate each one. One man claimed to have seen the two young men living as monks in a Buddhist monastery in Ladakh. Investigators contacted the monastery. No one matching their descriptions was there. Another woman insisted she had served them food at a roadside dhaba in Karnataka, thousands of kilometers from where they disappeared. The timeline made no sense, and when police showed her photographs, she admitted she was not actually certain. A particularly cruel hoax involved someone creating fake social media profiles for both Arjun and Vikram, posting messages claiming they were alive and would reveal themselves soon. The posts went viral before being exposed as fabrications created by someone seeking attention. The families were devastated anew, forced to publicly address the hoax, while privately grappling with the emotional whiplash of false hope. By 2022, 8 years gone, the case had settled into permanent cold status. The families still searched, still hoped in the way that you hope for miracles you do not truly believe will happen, still marked anniversaries and maintained their shrine. They had learned to live with the void, to exist alongside the absence, to carry their grief like a chronic illness that never kills but never heals. And then in August 2023, 9 years and 2 months after two friends rode away on a June morning, something impossible happened that would reignite every question and provide no answers. The Forestry Survey team had been working in the remote sections of Chamoli district for nearly 3 weeks. It was methodical, tedious work measuring tree diameters, recording species composition, marking GPS coordinates for later mapping. The team of 6 government forest workers moved through dense woodland with the slow thoroughness of people conducting a comprehensive inventory, knowing that their data would be used for resource management decisions over the coming decades. They were operating in terrain that saw few human visitors. There were no roads nearby, no maintained trails, no villages within several kilometers. This was old-growth forest, never commercially logged, dense with oak and rhododendron and Himalayan pine. The canopy was thick enough that even at midday, sunlight reached the forest floor in scattered patches, creating a dimly lit world where moss grew thick on tree bark, and the air smelled of damp earth and decomposing vegetation. On the 17th of August 2023, the team was working through a particularly challenging section where the undergrowth was dense and thorny, requiring careful navigation. Prakash Rawat, a junior surveyor in his late 20s, had been assigned to measure a cluster of large oak trees. He was working his way around the base of one particularly massive specimen, measuring its diameter at breast height, when something caught his eye, a brief glint of reflected sunlight from high in the canopy. His first thought was trash. Perhaps a piece of metal roofing material that had been carried by wind and lodged in the branches. People dumped garbage in remote areas, and strong storms could transport light materials considerable distances. But as he moved to get a better angle, circling the tree and looking up through breaks in the foliage, the shape of the object began to resolve into something that made no sense at all. It looked like a motorcycle, high in the tree branches. suspended approximately 15 feet above the forest floor, caught and held by thick branches that had grown around and through its frame. Prakash called out to his supervisor, a man named Ganesh Bhatt, who had been conducting forest surveys for over 20 years and had encountered many strange things in the woods. Ganesh arrived, looked where Prakash was pointing, and experienced the profound disorientation of seeing something impossible rendered undeniably real. It was absolutely a motorcycle, or what remained of one after years of exposure. The metal frame was heavily corroded, covered in moss and lichen, wrapped and held by tree branches that had clearly grown around it over time. The rest of the survey team gathered quickly, drawn by the excitement in their colleagues' voices. They stood in a rough circle beneath the tree, heads tilted back, trying to process what they were seeing. The motorcycle was positioned nearly upright, wedged between branches in a way that seemed almost intentional, as if it had been carefully placed rather than randomly deposited. The immediate questions were obvious and without apparent answers. How does a motorcycle end up 15 feet high in a tree in the middle of dense forest? The team discussed possibilities among themselves. Could it have been dropped from an aircraft? But what aircraft would be transporting a motorcycle through this region? And why would they drop it? And if it had fallen from significant height, it would have crashed through branches and hit the ground, not remained caught halfway up. Could it have been lifted there by a storm? But the region did not experience tornadoes, and even the most severe windstorms would not lift something as heavy as a motorcycle and deposit it carefully between branches. Could it be an art installation? But the motorcycle's condition, the rust, the biological growth, the branches that had clearly grown around it over years, indicated it had been there for a very long time, far longer than any temporary art project would remain. Ganesh made the decision to report the discovery immediately. This was beyond the scope of a forestry survey. Whatever this was, it required investigation by authorities. He radioed back to their base camp, describing what they had found and providing GPS coordinates. Base camp, in turn, contacted local police in Chamoli district, who initially responded with skepticism. A motorcycle in a tree? Was this some kind of joke? But Ganesh was a respected professional with decades of service, not someone who made prank reports. Police dispatched a team to investigate. It took several hours for police to reach the remote location. They had to drive as far as the nearest forest road allowed, then hike several kilometers through challenging terrain using the GPS coordinates the survey team had provided. When they arrived and saw what the forestry workers had found, their skepticism evaporated. They were looking at something that defied immediate explanation, something that would require resources beyond what local police could provide. Additional teams were called in: disaster management specialists, forensic investigators, forest department officials with technical climbing equipment. Photographs were taken from every possible angle, dozens of images documenting the motorcycle's position, the tree's condition, the surrounding terrain. Someone examined the motorcycle as closely as possible from ground level and noticed that portions of the license plate were still visible beneath rust and organic accumulation. The plate was carefully photographed with a telephoto lens, and the images were enhanced using digital software to improve visibility of the corroded numbers and letters. When the enhanced images were compared against vehicle registration databases, a match was found. The motorcycle had been registered to Vikram Singh of Dehradun, Uttarakhand. It had been reported missing in June 2014, along with its owner and his friend, Arjun Mehta. The discovery sent shockwaves through multiple systems simultaneously. Police communications channels lit up as information was relayed up the chain of command. The old case file from 2014, gathering dust in archives, was pulled and reviewed. Media outlets, monitoring police communications, picked up fragments of information and began making inquiries. And most importantly, phone calls had to be made to families who had spent 9 years in the particular hell of not knowing. Inspector Dhawan, who had led the original search operation in 2014 and was now nearing retirement, was asked to make the calls. He had maintained periodic contact with the families over the years, providing updates when there were updates to provide, which was almost never. Now he had to explain something that he himself did not understand. They had found the motorcycle. It was 40 kilometers from the last confirmed sighting. It was hanging in a tree in dense forest. No. They had not found the young men. No. He did not know what this meant. Recovery operations would begin tomorrow. Mira received the call while preparing dinner, a routine task that had become meditation, a way to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering to dark places. The phone rang. She saw Inspector Dawan's name on the screen, and her heart immediately began to race. He only called when there was something to report, and it had been years since the last call. She answered, her voice tight with anticipation and dread. The inspector's explanation made no sense. Motorcycle. Found. In a tree. Deep in the forest. Vikram's motorcycle. The words were English and Hindi that Mira understood individually, but could not assemble into coherent meaning. How do you find a motorcycle in a tree 9 years after it disappeared? How does a motorcycle get into a tree at all? Where are the boys? Where is Arjun? Inspector Dawan had no answers to these questions. He had only the fact of the discovery, as impossible as it was undeniable. He asked Mira to inform Vikram's family as well. Recovery operations would begin the next day. The families would be kept informed of all developments. He was sorry he could not provide more information. He was sorry about all of it. After the call ended, Mira stood in her kitchen holding the phone, her mind unable to process what she had just been told. Her next clear memory was of sitting on the floor, her back against the kitchen cabinets, shaking uncontrollably. Suresh found her there when he came home from an errand, and through her tears and gasping breaths, she tried to explain what Inspector Dawan had said. Rajesh received similar news and reacted with characteristic intensity. He immediately drove to the police station in Dehradun, demanding more information, demanding to go to the site, demanding anything that would make this incomprehensible discovery feel real. They found his son's motorcycle. After 9 years of searching, hanging in a tree in the middle of nowhere. Where was Vikram? Where was Arjun? What did this mean? The police could provide few answers. Only the fact of discovery. Only the promise that everything possible would be done to understand what had happened. Only the request for patience while recovery and investigation proceeded. That night, both families gathered at the Singh house, all of them too agitated to sleep, too confused to know what to feel. Was this progress? Was this closure? Was this the beginning of answers? Or just a new, stranger chapter of mystery? They did not know. They could only wait for morning and whatever revelations recovery operations might bring. The recovery operation was a complex undertaking that required specialized equipment and expertise. The motorcycle, wedged 15 feet high in the branches of a mature oak tree, could not simply be pulled down. The tree was stable and healthy, and authorities did not want to damage it unnecessarily. More importantly, the motorcycle itself was now evidence in what was officially an active missing persons investigation, and it needed to be recovered intact with as little disturbance as possible to any potential forensic evidence it might contain. A specialized forestry company was contracted to assist. They brought a mobile crane, but the dense forest and lack of roads meant the crane could not get close to the site. Instead, the crane was transported to the nearest accessible point, approximately half a kilometer away, then disassembled into components that could be carried by teams of workers through the forest. It took most of a day just to move the equipment to the location. While equipment was being positioned, an arborist examined the tree carefully. She assessed the branches supporting the motorcycle, checking their structural integrity, determining how much weight they could bear safely, planning the safest approach for removal. Her conclusion was that the branches were sound they had to have supported the motorcycle's weight for 9 years, but that cutting them carelessly could cause the bike to fall suddenly, potentially destroying evidence. By this time, national media had picked up the story. News vans were parked as close to the site as vehicles could get, and journalists were hiking in to observe and report. The strange detail, a motorcycle hanging in a tree 9 years after disappearance, was exactly the kind of mystery that captured public attention. Television crews filmed from various angles, news websites posted updates in real time. Social media exploded with speculation. The families, after anguished discussion, decided not to attend the recovery operation. They could not bear to watch, to be physically present for the retrieval of this artifact of their son's disappearance, to be spectacle for cameras and curiosity seekers. Inspector Dawan arranged for them to wait at district police headquarters in a private room where they could receive updates without being subjected to media scrutiny. The actual recovery began on the morning of August 19, 2 days after the initial discovery. Climbing arborists ascended the tree using ropes and harnesses, approaching the motorcycle carefully. They secured additional support lines to stabilize it, then began the delicate process of cutting the branches that held it. Each cut was made carefully, with spotters on the ground ready to guide the descent if the motorcycle shifted position. It took 6 hours of careful work. Branches were cut incrementally, the motorcycle lowered in stages, weight transferred gradually to support lines controlled by ground teams. When it finally reached the forest floor, it was laid carefully on its side on a large plastic tarp that had been positioned to receive it. Forensic technicians moved in immediately. The motorcycle was a ruin. 9 years of exposure to rain, snow, temperature extremes, and biological processes had transformed metal and mechanical components into something barely recognizable as a vehicle. The tires had rotted away completely, leaving only the metal rims. The seat was a frame of springs surrounded by scraps of disintegrated foam and fabric. Every metal surface was covered in thick rust, and moss had colonized the engine casing and fuel tank. But the frame was intact, bent in several places but not shattered, and the chassis number was still legible enough for positive identification. The most significant discovery came when technicians carefully examined the storage compartment beneath the seat. This compartment, a sealed metal box that riders typically use to store documents, tools, or small personal items, had remained relatively intact. The seal had not been perfect, water had infiltrated, but it had provided some protection to its contents. Inside, the compartment was a backpack. The fabric was heavily water-damaged, discolored, and partially decomposed, but present. Technicians carefully removed it and opened it under controlled conditions, photographing each stage of the process. The backpack contained several items: a small flashlight, corroded beyond function, a multi-tool, rusty but intact, a waterproof bag containing a GoPro camera, its protective casing cracked, but possibly still protecting the internal electronics and memory card, a wallet, and a small notebook journal. The wallet, opened carefully, contained a laminated national ID card belonging to Arjun Mehta. The lamination had protected the card from total destruction, and Arjun's photograph was still clearly visible, looking impossibly young, smiling at a camera years before everything went wrong. There were also some paper currency notes, disintegrated into pulp, and what might have been credit cards, too corroded to read. The journal was perhaps the most significant item. It was a small notebook, perhaps 10 by 15 centimeters, with a faux leather cover that had provided some protection from the elements. When technicians carefully opened it, they found that most pages were stuck together, swollen with moisture. The ink dissolved into illegible smears across the paper. But not all of it. Approximately halfway through the journal, a few entries remained partially legible. Forensic document specialists used careful drying techniques and digital enhancement to recover what text they could. Most was too damaged, but one entry was readable enough for transcription. The date at the top was smudged and unclear, but the entry itself, written in Hindi in Arjun's distinctive handwriting, read, "रात में अजीब आवाजें, विक्रम भी सुन रहा है, हमें नहीं पता क्या है, कुछ हमारा पीछा कर रहा है चोटी से, सुबह जल्दी निकलने की कोशिश करेंगे." Translated, "Strange sounds at night, Vikram hearing too. We don't know what it is. Something followed us from the ridge. We'll try to leave early in the morning." The entry, photographed in high resolution and examined by forensic document experts, was confirmed to be in Arjun's handwriting. The ink, though faded and partially dissolved, showed characteristics consistent with the blue gel pen found elsewhere in the backpack. The paper's deterioration pattern suggested the journal had been in the storage compartment since shortly after the entry was written, protected from the worst of the elements but not entirely shielded. This single journal entry, the only substantial written record recovered from 9 years of exposure, provided no answers, but deepened the mystery significantly. Something followed us from the ridge. What something? An animal? Another person? Or was it the kind of atmospheric dread that isolated places can inspire, the feeling of being watched or pursued that may have no basis in external reality? The families were shown photographs of the recovered items, Mira looked at the image of the journal entry and felt her grief transform into something sharper and more terrible. Her son had been afraid, had been in danger, had known something was wrong. The journal entry proved that whatever happened was not a simple accident, not a quick death without awareness. They had been pursued by something, threatened by something, frightened by something. Rajesh focused obsessively on different details. From the ridge, the entry said. Which ridge? The route included several ridge crossings. When was this written? The lack of a legible date meant it could have been the first night, the second night, any night. How long had they been aware of danger before whatever happened actually happened? The GoPro camera was sent immediately to a specialized digital forensics laboratory in Delhi. If the memory card inside had somehow survived, if any footage could be recovered, it might provide visual documentation of their final days. It might show what they had seen, what had frightened them, what had ultimately happened. The families were told that water damage to digital storage was among the most difficult types of data recovery, but that specialists would attempt everything possible. The process would take weeks, possibly longer. Forensic examination of the motorcycle frame itself provided additional questions without corresponding answers. The metal showed significant impact damage, but the pattern was unusual. The front fork, the component connecting the front wheel to the frame, was bent backward sharply, consistent with a strong frontal impact. But the rear frame showed equally severe damage, bent and twisted in ways that suggested force applied from multiple directions, not a single vector impact like hitting a wall or falling off a cliff. The fuel tank was ruptured, a jagged tear running along one side. The interior was long since empty of any fuel, but the metal around the tear showed stress patterns that suggested sudden, extreme pressure rather than the gradual corrosion that had affected other components. An automotive forensic specialist examined the damage patterns and concluded that they were not consistent with any standard motorcycle accident scenario he had encountered. Most significantly, there were no human remains. Not with the motorcycle, not in the surrounding area, nowhere within a reasonable search radius. Cadaver dogs were brought to the site and given articles of clothing belonging to both Arjun and Vikram. The dogs, trained to detect human decomposition, were given time to work the area thoroughly. They showed no alert responses. Whatever had happened to the two young men, their bodies were not present in this location. The forest floor around the tree was examined with extraordinary care. Forensic botanists analyzed vegetation, looking for any areas of disturbed growth that might indicate burial. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan for subsurface anomalies. A grid pattern was established, and every square meter within a 100-meter radius was carefully searched. Teams looked for bone fragments, clothing fibers, any organic or inorganic trace that might indicate human presence. They found nothing. It was as if Arjun and Vikram had simply ceased to exist as physical beings, leaving behind only their motorcycle as an incomprehensible monument to their disappearance. Within days of the recovery, theories began proliferating across every platform where people discussed unexplained phenomena. The facts were strange enough to invite speculation, but vague enough to resist definitive explanation. A motorcycle, belonging to two young men who disappeared 9 years earlier, found hanging 15 feet high in a tree in dense forest, 40 kilometers from their last confirmed location, with a journal entry suggesting they had been pursued by something unidentified. It was mystery, layered upon mystery, each question leading to several more. The most scientifically grounded theory suggested flash flooding. Himalayan regions experience intense monsoon rains, and flash floods in mountain terrain can be catastrophically powerful. Water funneled through narrow valleys can reach tremendous velocity, capable of moving vehicles, boulders, even buildings. Perhaps, this theory suggested, Arjun and Vikram had been caught by a sudden flood, possibly while camped near a stream or while crossing a watercourse. The flood could have carried them and their motorcycle downstream, the churning water and debris lifting the bike and depositing it in the tree as waters receded. But this theory faced significant problems. Hydrologists examined the terrain around the recovery site and found no evidence of watercourses capable of producing such flooding. The tree was not in a drainage path. The forest floor showed no signs of historical flood damage, no stripped vegetation, no sediment deposits, no scoured earth, none of the geological markers that major flooding leaves behind. And if water had been powerful enough to lift a motorcycle 15 feet into a tree, where were the bodies? Water that violent would have carried them along as well, and bodies or remains would eventually surface somewhere downstream. Another theory proposed a landslide or avalanche. Mountain terrain is subject to sudden slope failures, especially after heavy rains or during spring snowmelt. Perhaps a massive movement of earth and rock had caught the two men, carrying them and their motorcycle into the forest. The force of sliding debris could theoretically deposit a vehicle in a tree if the circumstances were exactly right. But again, evidence did not support this scenario. Geological surveys of the area showed no recent landslide activity. There were no cliff faces or steep slopes above the recovery site from which debris could have originated. No debris field of the scattered rocks and soil that would accompany a landslide. The forest showed no signs of the kind of catastrophic disturbance that a landslide large enough to carry a motorcycle would necessarily create. Wildlife attack was considered and dismissed by every expert consulted. No animal, regardless of size or strength, could lift a 180-kilogram motorcycle into a tree. The journal entries reference to something following them might suggest animal involvement in their disappearance. But animals do not create mysteries of this nature. If predators had killed them, remains would be present, scattered perhaps by scavenger activity, but present. Human involvement was investigated thoroughly. Could someone have killed the two friends, disposed of their bodies, and staged this bizarre scene to confuse investigators? A criminal profiler examined the scenario and concluded it was theoretically possible but highly implausible. The logistics were daunting. Moving a motorcycle to a remote forest location, lifting it 15 feet into a tree, this would require specialized equipment, multiple people, significant time and effort. What would be the motive? If robbery was the goal, why not simply take the motorcycle and leave the bodies? Why create an elaborate mystery that would only draw attention? Police interviewed potential suspects, anyone with known criminal activity in the region during June 2014, anyone with any connection to the missing men, anyone who might have had motive or opportunity. Every lead terminated in dead ends. No credible evidence pointed toward homicide. The online community of mystery enthusiasts embraced the case with tremendous energy. Reddit threads dedicated to unsolved disappearances analyzed every detail. Users created detailed timelines, mapped possible routes, debated theories with the passion of people for whom the mystery was a puzzle rather than a tragedy. Some theories remained grounded in physical possibility. Others ventured into speculation that strained credibility. One persistent theory suggested military involvement. The region contained army installations and restricted areas. Perhaps Arjun and Vikram had inadvertently entered a prohibited zone, witnessed something classified, and been disappeared by authorities to protect secrets. The staged discovery of the motorcycle 9 years later was meant to provide closure without revealing the truth. This theory was popular among those predisposed to distrust government, but it collapsed under scrutiny. Military operations leave paper trails. The number of people who would need to be involved in such a cover-up made maintaining secrecy essentially impossible, and there was no evidence of any kind supporting military involvement. Paranormal explanations proliferated on platforms dedicated to unexplained phenomena. Some proposed alien abduction, suggesting that the motorcycle's placement in the tree was the result of being dropped from an unidentified craft. Others discussed dimensional portals or time anomalies, proposing that Arjun and Vikram had somehow slipped into an alternate reality, leaving only their motorcycle behind as physical evidence of the transition. These theories were taken seriously by certain communities but dismissed entirely by investigators. Cryptozoology enthusiasts proposed the involvement of unknown animals. The Himalayas had long been associated with legends of the Yeti or other undiscovered primates. Perhaps something unknown to science inhabited these forests, something large and strong enough to have attacked the two men and moved their motorcycle. This theory could not be disproven. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it also could not be proven, and most considered it highly unlikely. The families found all of this speculation overwhelming and, in many cases, offensive. Online theorists were treating their son's disappearance as entertainment, as an intellectual puzzle to be solved from the comfort of their homes, detached from the actual human cost of the mystery. Arjun and Vikram were not characters in someone else's story. They were real people with families who loved them, who had spent 9 years in agony, who wanted answers, but not the kind of fantastical speculation that reduced tragedy to spectacle. Weeks stretched into months. The GoPro camera provided the most frustrating dead end. Despite the best efforts of multiple digital forensics experts, the memory card had been too severely compromised. Water intrusion had caused corrosion on the delicate electronic traces. The data, whatever footage Arjun had recorded of their final days, was irretrievably lost. What might have been visual documentation of their last hours, possibly including whatever they had encountered, was degraded to random magnetic noise that no recovery software could reconstruct into meaningful information. The journal was analyzed by multiple specialists. Forensic linguists examined the phrasing and tone of the legible entry. The language suggested concern, but not panic. Something followed us from the ridge, indicated awareness of pursuit or danger, but was frustratingly vague. Was it an animal? Another person? A group of people? Or was it the psychological phenomenon of feeling watched or threatened that can occur in isolated wilderness, a sensation that may have no external cause? Investigators attempted to identify which ridge the journal might reference. The planned route included several ridge crossings and passes. Teams reviewed weather reports from June 2014, looking for storms or unusual conditions that might have created dangers or altered the travelers' planned route. They interviewed other people who had been traveling in the region during that time frame. Several dozen adventure motorcyclists, trekkers, and tourists had been in the general area. None reported seeing Arjun and Vikram after they left Joshimath. None reported unusual animal activity, dangerous human encounters, or severe weather events. The physical search was expanded one final time. If the motorcycle had been at that specific tree for 9 years, perhaps the bodies were somewhere nearby, overlooked in previous searches conducted before the motorcycle was found, hidden by terrain, or decomposed beyond easy detection. A comprehensive search operation covered a 5-kilometer radius from the recovery site. Teams worked in grid patterns, clearing undergrowth, exploring caves and crevices, following stream beds, checking anywhere that remains might be concealed. The forest surrendered nothing. After weeks of intensive searching, not a single additional piece of evidence was found. No bone fragments, no clothing fibers caught on branches, no camping equipment, no secondary personal items. Nothing beyond what had been recovered from the motorcycle's storage compartment. Local residents, when interviewed during this expanded search, provided little concrete information but much folklore. Older residents spoke of the forest as a place with a dark history. People had been disappearing in these mountains for generations, they said. Not frequently, but regularly enough that everyone knew stories. Some who went missing were eventually found, alive or dead, with explanations that made sense. Others were never found, or were found in circumstances that made no sense. One elderly woman, nearly 90 years old, spoke through her grandson, who translated her local dialect into Hindi. She remembered, she said, when she was a young girl, 2 hunters who went into the deep forest and never returned. Searchers found their rifles hung in a tree, impossibly high, but never found the men. That was in the 1,950 seconds, or maybe the 1,940 seconds. Her memory of dates was unclear. But the story was the same: objects found in trees, people gone without explanation. These stories were documented carefully by investigators but ultimately set aside as folklore, the kind of legends that accumulate around any dangerous wilderness. Mountains kill people through entirely natural means. Over decades and centuries, the statistical accumulation of tragedies creates the appearance of pattern where there may be only coincidence. But the motorcycle in the tree resisted natural explanation more stubbornly than most mysteries. Every scenario investigators constructed contained logical flaws, inconsistencies between physical evidence and proposed mechanism. Natural forces powerful enough to place a motorcycle in a tree should have left other evidence. Human involvement sophisticated enough to stage such a mystery should have left traces of the staging. Animal activity could not explain the central impossibility of the motorcycle's position. 3 months after the discovery, Inspector Dawan convened a final case review meeting with forensic specialists, search coordinators, and representatives from various agencies that had contributed expertise. The conclusion was unavoidable. They had no explanation. The case file would be updated with new findings, but those findings led nowhere. The official determination was revised to unresolved death under suspicious circumstances, language that acknowledged the impossibility of calling this a simple missing persons case, while also acknowledging the complete absence of explanatory evidence. The families were provided copies of all forensic reports, recovery documentation, and analysis. These documents, thorough and professional, were ultimately useless for providing the closure that families needed. The reports documented what was known a motorcycle found in a tree, personal items recovered, damage patterns analyzed, but could not explain what it meant. Mira kept the recovered journal in a sealed archival bag. She would occasionally take it out, not to read it. The legible content had long since been memorized, but simply to hold, to touch something her son had touched. The words, "something followed us," became a mantra that cycled endlessly through her mind. What followed them? Why? What happened in those final hours or days? The questions were worse than having no information at all, because they transformed abstract grief into concrete terror. Her son had been afraid, had been in danger, had perhaps known he was going to die, and she had not been there. Rajesh commissioned a permanent memorial at the recovery site. It took weeks to arrange obtaining permissions, transporting materials through difficult terrain, hiring workers to construct it. The memorial was a simple granite stone, approximately 1 meter tall, engraved with both names and dates. Arjun Mehta and Vikram Singh, lost June 2014, found August 2023, forever remembered. The stone was set in concrete to prevent displacement, surrounded by a small cleared area where visitors could stand. Rajesh visited the memorial once after its installation, making the difficult hike through forest trails that had been slightly improved by the traffic of search teams and recovery operations. He stood beneath the tree branches, now trimmed where they had been cut during recovery, and looked up at the empty space where the motorcycle had hung for 9 years. He tried to understand, tried to imagine any scenario that made sense, found nothing but the same void that had existed since June 2014, now deeper and stranger for having briefly promised answers. Media attention gradually faded. The story had provided several weeks of compelling mystery, but without resolution, without new developments, public attention moved to other stories, other mysteries, other tragedies. The case became a footnote in documentaries about unsolved disappearances, referenced in articles about strange findings, discussed in online forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena. But for the wider world, it ceased to be immediate news and became instead a strange historical curiosity. A year has passed since the discovery. It is now late 2024, 10 years and several months since two friends rode away on a June morning in 2014. The families continue their lives because there is no alternative. They have learned to carry this new, stranger version of grief that now includes partial answers that only deepen the mystery. Mira still attends her support group for families of missing persons, but her role has evolved. She now helps newly devastated families navigate the early stages of loss, providing the hard-won wisdom of someone who has survived a decade of not knowing. She tells them that they will learn to live with uncertainty, that the weight will become familiar even if it never becomes light. She does not tell them that sometimes answers are worse than absence, that sometimes what you learn makes everything more painful. Suresh has found a kind of peace, or at least resignation. He has stopped expecting resolution. The motorcycle in the tree was not the beginning of answers. It was simply a strange coda to a tragedy that will never be fully understood. He tends his garden now, a hobby he took up during the pandemic lockdowns, and finds that coaxing life from soil provides a counterbalance to dwelling on death and mystery. Rajesh's insomnia has improved, though he still wakes occasionally at 3 in the morning with his mind full of questions. The discovery of the motorcycle brought a brief renewal of obsessive investigation, but eventually even he had to accept that there was nowhere left to search, no stone left to turn. He visits the memorial site twice a year now, on Vikram's birthday, and on the anniversary of his disappearance, and he speaks to his son as though the stone can hear him, providing updates on family news, on the business, on the life that continues in Vikram's absence. Priya has written a second book, this one titled After the Finding, When Answers Don't Bring Closure. It is more philosophical than her first, exploring the nature of mystery and uncertainty, examining how humans psychologically process unresolved loss. The book has found an audience beyond families of missing persons, resonating with anyone who has experienced the frustration of questions that cannot be answered. The case officially remains open, as missing persons cases do, until bodies are recovered or death certificates are issued. But no detective is actively working it. No new leads are being pursued. The file sits in archives, remarkably thick for a case that produced so little actionable evidence, full of photographs and witness statements and forensic reports that document everything except what actually happened. Occasionally, someone new discovers the story, a podcast producer, a documentary filmmaker, a journalist looking for an unsolved mystery to explore. They contact the families, requesting interviews, hoping for some angle that previous coverage missed. The families usually decline. They have told their story enough times. They have relived the trauma repeatedly for public consumption. There is nothing new to say. The forest where the motorcycle was found continues its slow, patient growth. The memorial stone stands in its small clearing, visited occasionally by curious hikers who have heard the story, more often by local wildlife that pays no attention to human monuments. The tree itself, having been relieved of its strange burden, grows no differently than it did before, adding annual rings, reaching skyward, indifferent to the human grief associated with its branches. And somewhere in the vastness of the Himalayas, in places where maps leave spaces blank and human activity leaves no permanent mark, two young men remain lost. Not lost to accident or animal or weather, but lost to something else. Something that 9 years of searching and one impossible discovery could not explain. The motorcycle hanging in a tree was not a clue. It was a question mark, a monument to mystery itself. Proof that some disappearances resist all human understanding. The families live now with that knowledge, carrying it like a weight in their chest that can never be set down. There will be no closure, no revelation, no moment when everything suddenly makes sense. There is only the continuing absence, the permanent wound, the questions that cannot be answered no matter how many years pass. The last words in Arjun's journal, "Something followed us from the ridge," remain their final communication with a world that can no longer reach them. Whatever followed them, caught them. Where they went, whether they went anywhere at all, is a question that not even the impossible discovery of their motorcycle could answer. The mountains keep their secrets. They took two young men on a bright June day in 2014, left behind an artifact years later in a place and manner that made no sense, and offered nothing else, no bodies, no explanation, no mercy. Just the eternal silence of high places and the grief of those left behind to carry questions that have no answers. The case of Arjun Mehta and Vikram Singh remains, in every sense that matters, unresolved. It stands as a reminder that the world still contains mysteries beyond solving, voids beyond filling, absences that shape the lives of the living far more than presence ever could. And in the homes in Dehradun, where their families continue their lives, 2 empty rooms remain untouched. Shrines to young men who rode away one morning and became ghosts, leaving behind only fragments, a rusted motorcycle, a water-damaged journal, a warning about something that followed from the ridge, and questions that will echo unanswered through all the years remaining.